In October of 2010, a 42-year-old engineer from Portland, Kurt Potts, set out on a 2-day hike in the Willamette National Forest. He planned to hike a short loop on the Pine Ridge Loop Trail, take some pictures of the fall forest, and return home the next evening. 2 days later, his pickup truck was found locked in a parking lot, and the trail's footprints broke off near a stream. Kurt Potts had disappeared without a trace. 11 years had passed, and when firefighters were dismantling a burned-out garage in the suburbs of Bend, they came across a huge stuffed bear. Inside, among the sawdust and metal frames, were human remains. It was Kurt Potts, a man who had become part of his own mystery. On October 15, 2010, at dawn, the sky over the suburbs of Portland was dim and low. A drizzle barely touched the windshield of an old Ford Ranger. Kurt Potts, a 42-year-old electrical engineer, stood beside his car, a thermos in his hand. His wife, Jennifer, recalled later that he looked familiar calm and a little tired after a week of work. Before leaving, he said briefly, "For a day, no more. I'll be back tomorrow night." According to the woman, it was an ordinary trip, like dozens of previous ones. He left around 6 o'clock in the morning, heading along the highway toward the town of Bend. The route on the map on his phone was straightforward, through Santiam Pass into the Willamette National Forest. It was his favorite destination. Colleagues said that Potts often went there when he wanted to clear his head after a long change in the company where he had worked for more than a decade. He was not an extreme hiker and always chose short routes, familiar and safe. At 10 o'clock and 14 minutes, a camera at the Cascade fuel stop gas station captured his pickup truck at the pump. Kurt filled up the tank, bought coffee, and 2 sandwiches. The cashier, Julie Evans, described him as a calm, clean-cut man with a warm voice. The video shows him leaving the store, smiling and adjusting the hood of his jacket. This was the last time he was seen alive. Around 11 o'clock, he arrived at the parking lot near the Pine Ridge Loop Trail. The parking lot is small for 5 cars surrounded by pine trees. According to other tourists, there were only 3 cars there that morning. One of them was Potts's dark green Ford. It was recognized later when the search was already underway. The trail itself passed through a dense coniferous forest and reached a small plateau overlooking the Mackenzie River. The fall in Willamette that year was cold. The wind carried the smell of damp bark, and the leaves crunched underfoot. Kurt left his jacket, a folded map, and a water bottle in the car. Perhaps he decided that the hike would be short. Jennifer told the police that she was waiting for him the next evening on October 16th. At about 9 o'clock, she texted him, "How was the trip?" but received no response. At first, the phone gave short beeps, then disappeared from the network. The next day, she tried not to panic, believing that her husband could have been delayed. However, on Monday, October 18th, when Kurt did not show up for work and did not answer his phone, she contacted the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office. Detectives filed a missing persons report. On Tuesday, October 19th, a patrol found Potts's pickup truck in the same parking lot where the owner had left it. The car was locked with no signs of forced entry. Inside was a thermos with leftover cold coffee, Oregon road maps, sunglasses, and a spare phone battery. The keys were in the glove compartment, which looked strange. Experienced tourists usually take them with them. Rescuers from Central Oregon Search and Rescue began to survey the area. According to the group's leader, Brian Neal, they hiked the entire Pine Ridge Loop and several other neighboring trails, but found no traces. In some places, the grass was crumpled, but the rain made it impossible to determine the direction of travel. 3 miles from the parking lot, they found the remains of a small fire and an empty energy bar package. Analysis showed that it was the same brand that Potts had bought at the gas station. However, neither a backpack nor signs of a struggle were found around. The search lasted several days. Volunteers, dog handlers, and a Forest Service helicopter were involved. The pilot reported that from above, the forest looked like a solid dark blanket, without any gaps or camp marks. On the night of October 20th, temperatures dropped below freezing and fog covered the valley. None of the search dogs could confidently pick up the trail. One short route led to a stream where the rocky bottom was washed away by rain. The boot prints were lost there. It seemed as if the man had simply vanished into thin air. The local sheriff's department officially registered the disappearance without signs of a crime. Potts's colleagues and friends described him as a sensible, non-conflicted man who had no debts and no enemies. He did not drink alcohol, had no mental disorders, and was a good father. The only thing that was surprising was his habit of going to the forest alone. His wife explained it simply. He said the forest was the only place to think. Within 2 weeks, the rescue operation covered almost 30 square miles of territory. All side trails, hunting huts, riverbeds, and abandoned campsites were checked. But there was nothing. Not even a piece of equipment was found. When the first snow fell in late October, the search was suspended. The file with his name was moved to the Unexplained Disappearances section. The sheriff's report stated, "Possible disorientation, accident, body not found." For the family, this line meant nothing. Jennifer would call the department on the same day every year, asking if there was anything new. But in the Willamette Forest, where the leaves fell on the same paths every year, nothing changed. And no one guessed that the answer to the question of where Kurt Potts had disappeared would be in the dust, sawdust, and glass of a melted chuchal. The morning of October 19, 2010 began with fog. A cold drizzle spread over the parking lot near the Pine Ridge Loop Trail, where Kurt Potts's dark green Ford was parked. It was here that the base of the search operation was set up. Rescuers from Central Oregon Search and Rescue, U.S. Forest Service employees, and several dozen volunteers arrived at the site. All of them realized that more than 3 days had passed since the disappearance, and every hour was working against them. The search was led by Rescue Lieutenant Brian Neal, an experienced coordinator who had participated in similar operations many times. His report states, "Weather conditions are satisfactory. Visibility is limited. The probable search area is 3 to 5 miles from the parking lot. The goal is to find a living person." Dog handlers were the first to enter the forest. 2 sniffer dogs took scent samples from Potts's belongings found in the car: gloves, a cap, a spare t-shirt. The search area stretched for several miles, and the coordinates were marked on electronic maps. A Forest Service helicopter flew over the tops of the spruce trees, but thick fog and clouds made it difficult to see the ground. That same day, Kurt's wife, Jennifer, arrived in Bend with his brother, Paul. They stayed in a motel nearby. Witnesses recalled that Jennifer was calm, almost cold, as if she did not allow herself to panic. She told the rescuers, "He never took any chances. If he doesn't answer, something has happened." On the 3rd day of the search, one of the groups came to a small clearing 3 miles from the parking lot. There they found traces of a recent campfire, several food wrappers, and a crumpled napkin. Based on the description and decomposition time of the remains, experts determined that the parking lot might have belonged to Kurt. On the back of one wrapper was a fingerprint with a partially preserved print, which was later compared to his personal belongings. The camp looked orderly. No signs of a struggle, scattered items, or blood. The dogs picked up the trail from the campfire site, moving further north, deeper into the forest. Half a mile from the campsite, they stopped at a narrow stream with a bottom made up of large rocks. After several attempts, the dogs lost their direction as the scent disappeared. One of the dog handlers noted in his report, "It looks like the trail broke off in the water. The person could have crossed the stream or fallen into it." They began to examine the surrounding ravines and gorges. The groups moved in strictly defined sectors. Each participant had a GPS tracker so as not to repeat the areas they had already covered. But even with modern equipment, the search yielded 0 results. The area seemed endless: dark slopes, fallen trees, silence that swallowed up even the sound of footsteps. The report of October 22 states, "No new tracks were found. Weather conditions are deteriorating. There is ice in some places." Nevertheless, the operation was expanded, with volunteers from neighboring counties, aircraft, and special thermal imaging cameras joining the search. But no human-like heat signals were detected. In those days, journalists from local channels came to Bend. Video from the search site showed people in brightly colored jackets combing through the brush and Potts' car covered in a thin layer of frost. In the evening, Jennifer stood near the tents, her face hidden by a hood. She declined to comment, saying only, "He knew these woods better than anyone." After a week of fruitless searching, Sheriff's Detective Mark Ross took control of the case. He was 38, former military, calm, and meticulous. Ross began by checking all the obvious leads. He contacted the bank and found out that Potts' accounts had not moved since he disappeared. The phone last registered on the network in the forest at 15 o'clock on October 16th. After that, the signal disappeared. The detective interviewed the man's co-workers at the Portland Electric Systems plant. They all said the same thing. Kurt was responsible, punctual, and had no conflicts. One of the employees recalled that on the eve of his disappearance, Potts had been delivering a large project and looked exhausted, but not anxious. Several possible scenarios were considered. The first was an accident, a fall, injury, or loss of orientation. The second was an attack by a wild animal, most likely a cougar or black bear. However, a biologist from the Forest Service, Dr. Richard Kane, explained that in recent years there have been no reports of animal aggression against humans in the area. The third version is a voluntary disappearance. But the wife categorically denied this possibility. In a conversation with the detective, she said, "He would not have left the children. He even called every night for a business trip." Jennifer's words were included in the official report. On the 10th day of the search, one of the volunteers came across a piece of blue cloth tangled between branches. The color matched Potts' jacket, but laboratory analysis later showed that it was a remnant of an old camping tent. Hope faded. When snow fell in late October, Search Commander Brian Neal gathered the group and announced the end of the active phase. The decision was made officially with the approval of the county sheriff. The case file was reclassified as missing under unexplained circumstances. That evening, Jennifer Potts arrived at the parking lot where her husband's empty car was parked. She left bouquets of wildflowers she had picked on the hood and stood in silence for a while. Later, one of the rescuers said in an interview, "In the forest, it felt as if he had simply disappeared, not dead, not lost, but gone." Search equipment, maps, tents, everything was packed up in one day. The autumn forest became deserted again. The rescuers' watches stopped beeping, the helicopter flew back to the base, and Potts' Ford Ranger was transported to the police garage. The reports left only a cold wording. The search was inconclusive. No signs of a crime were found. Thus, modern technology, thermal imagers, dozens of people and drones could not answer the simple question of where the man who knew these trails from childhood had gone. And the Willamette Forest, dark and damp, seemed to keep its secret, not wanting to give it back to anyone. In early November of 2010, the investigation into Kurt Potts' disappearance officially became a case of indeterminate outcome. The Deschutes County Sheriff's Department filed all the documents, search team reports, interrogation protocols, maps with sector markings. But Detective Mark Ross was in no hurry to call it a day. He would arrive at work earlier than the others, sit down in his office with a cup of cold coffee, and spend hours going through the same pages, looking for a detail that might have been missed. In his notes, Ross noted that the case gave him a professional sense of incompleteness. He did not see the logic in the fact that an experienced hiker had disappeared several miles off the road without leaving a single clue. On the table was a map of the Willamette Forest, decorated with pins and ribbons. Each color represented a new attempt to understand where and how Potts might have disappeared. Most of the testimonies sent to the police station were meaningless. People wrote that they had seen a man who looked like him in Washington, D.C. at mountain campsites or even on the California coast. Others reported suspicious noises or a light deep in the woods. Ross admitted to a colleague that in such cases, most witnesses see what they want to see. But one day, a new visitor appeared in his office. He was an elderly man in a hunting jacket with a worn patch on the sleeve. He introduced himself as Alvin Crawford, a local hunter who often goes into the mountains to hunt. According to him, he did not immediately decide to go to the police. At first, he believed that what he saw had nothing to do with the missing tourist. Alvin said that a week before the search for Potts was announced, he was hunting in the same area, closer to the western slopes. That day, around noon, he came across a man walking along the old service road without a gun, but with a large backpack and a set of tools in his hands. The man looked to be in his 50s, unkempt, with a thick beard and a cold look in his eyes. Crawford noted that he behaved strangely. Instead of greeting him, he shouted at him to get off his land. His voice was not just angry, but an outright threat. The hunter described the meeting place, a narrow gap between two hills, near a stream. He tried to go another way, but when he looked back, he noticed that the stranger was following him at a distance. Crawford then picked up his pace and soon reached the main path. He never saw him again. A few days later, he learned about the disappearance of the tourist and suspected that the two events might be related. Detective Ross listened carefully to the witness. He wrote in his report, "The subject was described as a man of indeterminate age, bearded, wearing dirty camouflage. He behaved aggressively, demanded to leave the territory he called his own." This was the first real evidence that hinted at the possible presence of an outsider in the forest, someone capable of violence. Ross immediately checked the database of locals who lived in remote areas of the Willamette. The list included several dozen hunters, farmers, and former loggers. Some did have reputations as hermits, but none fit the description. When Ross showed photos of several possible candidates to Crawford, he couldn't recognize any of them. "His eyes were something I wouldn't forget," the hunter said before walking away. This phrase was included in the police report without comment. Ross spent the following weeks in endless checks. He reviewed old reports of violations in the forest, poaching incidents, and conflicts with locals. None of them matched in time or nature. The detective sent out inquiries to neighboring counties to see if there had been any complaints about aggressive hermits or strange camps in the mountains. The answer was short. Nothing of the sort has been reported. In December, when the forest was covered with snow, the trail finally went cold. Crawford was summoned again for clarification, but he did not add any new details. His story remained the same, as if carved in stone. The detective began to doubt whether the testimony was even reliable, not because of any distrust of the hunter, but because of the usual trap of such cases, people trying to explain what has no explanation. And yet, a new line appeared in Ross's notes. Possible presence of an unknown male residing in the forest permanently. Motives unknown. The work on the hermit version became personal for him. He began to collect an unofficial database, fragments of conversations with rangers, information about abandoned hunting huts, photographs of old camps. From these disparate pieces grew a portrait of someone who might actually exist, a man who had long since broken away from civilization and saw the forest not as nature, but as his own territory. But everything remained just an assumption. No name, no address, no evidence. Not a single document confirmed the existence of such a man. Later, the Kurt Potts case was again on the archive shelf. In the detective's official reports, the last entry is dated the end of December. No further action is possible due to lack of new information. Recommendation is to keep the case open for possible future testimony. Jennifer Potts had already returned to Portland by then. She continued to call the department every month, then only once a year in October. Every time Ross heard her voice on the phone, he answered the same way. Nothing new yet. The forest was silent, as it had been before. Only the old hunters who walked those trails sometimes said they felt a look that belonged to neither beast nor man. But police reports do not record such things. The August morning of 2021 began calmly. The town of Bend, nestled between Pine Hills, was waking up from the heat of the previous days. Around 7 o'clock in the morning, the fire department dispatcher received a call about smoke in the neighborhood north of town. The old workshop of a hunting guide named Harrison Boyd was on fire. According to neighbors, he was repairing boats, making hunting trophies, and collecting old stuffed animals. Firefighters arrived 20 minutes later. The garage was already burning with open flames, the roof had collapsed, and the windows had burst. When the fire was contained, Boyd was found unconscious in a house nearby. He was breathing in smoke, but he was alive. He was taken to the city hospital. At the scene of the fire, only burnt beams, pieces of metal, and a pile of half-melted hunting trophies remained. One strange thing survived among the wreckage: a large stuffed brown bear, almost as tall as a man. It was put outside to see if it would catch fire again. The outside was burnt, but the inside was almost intact. When one of the sheriff's office employees who was inspecting the area came closer, he noticed something that did not belong to the animal. A piece of bright blue synthetic fabric was sticking out of the torn abdomen. The fabric was too thin for a hunting prop, and it looked like it came not from the padding, but deeper inside the structure. The discovery aroused suspicion. Criminologists were called to the scene. They carefully transported the scarecrow to the Deschutes County Laboratory. The autopsy procedure was carried out as if it were a real body, with every step recorded. Under a thick layer of sawdust and a frame of steel bars, they discovered the unexpected. Inside, in a position that resembled a curled-up person, were human bones. The skull, chest, arm fragments, and tissue fragments were all crammed into the space that had once been the bear's torso. Experts carefully removed the remains. Nearby, they found fragments of a clockwork and a plastic card with the inscription, "Driver License," still visible through a layer of dirt. State of Oregon. After cleaning, the text became clearer. The name, Kurt Potts. After 11 years of obscurity, the body of the missing engineer from Portland was found not in the mountains or in the river, but inside a hunting trophy. The news instantly spread through the city. Reporters surrounded the scene, and guards were posted outside the hospital where Harrison Boyd was treated. In the first hours after the discovery, investigators did not give official comments. One of the firefighters, who was among the first to arrive later, told reporters, "We thought it was just a burnt scarecrow. When we realized there was a person inside, everyone's hands were shaking." Detective Mark Ross, who once handled Potts's case, was called to the station at 9 in the morning. He was given a brief report: a fire, a scarecrow, human remains. Ross went to the scene in person. What he saw seemed like a phantasmagoria. In the yard, among the soot and broken windows, there was a burnt bear, like a giant cavity looking inward. Forensic experts confirmed that the remains belonged to an adult male between the ages of 40 and 45, approximately Potts' height. There were no animal marks on the bones, only thin cuts made with a knife. He was wearing a blue membrane hiking jacket, pants made of water-repellent fabric, and hiking boots. This is exactly the outfit his wife described 11 years ago. When the lab finished the preliminary analysis, everything matched: the dental records, the shape of the humerus fracture, and the old injury recorded in the medical records. Kurt Potts was officially declared dead. The strangest part of the whole story was how and where he was found. Harrison Boyd, the owner of the burned-out workshop, was not an unknown recluse. On the contrary, he was known in Bend as a rough but experienced hunter-guide who once led tourists on hikes in the Cascade Mountains. After injuring his leg, he quit his job and opened a small taxidermy shop. His neighbors described him as a withdrawn person who could not tolerate other people's presence. One of them told the police, "He wouldn't let anyone into the garage. He would go weeks without coming out, and then suddenly burn the garbage while we were sleeping." When Ross learned that Boyd had survived, he immediately went to the hospital. There, the suspect was under observation in a stable condition. He was allowed to talk to him only briefly. According to the nurse, Boyd was semi-conscious, did not understand what was happening, and kept asking if his robots had survived. While the detective was waiting for permission to interrogate him, he carefully reviewed photos of the fire scene. One of the pictures shows a large workbench, burnt cans of glue and formalin, and the remains of wooden frames. Another shows rows of burnt stuffed animals, moose, wolves, birds, and among them, that very bear. The discovery turned the tables on a case that had long been considered dead. There was no logical explanation. How could Potts's body end up in the workshop of a hunting guide who lived 100 miles away from where he disappeared? Why did no one suspect anything for 11 years? And most importantly, why did someone decide to hide the body in this way? In the evening of the same day, the police officially announced the reopening of the Kurt Potts case. Detective Ross was again in charge of the investigation. He was faced with a case that had started as a simple disappearance of a tourist, but had now turned into something much darker. In the hospital yard where he went after the first interrogation, there were journalists. They asked if the body they found was really Potts. Ross did not answer. There was only one question pulsating in his head. What makes a man do to another what he does only to trophies? The Willamette Forest, which had remained silent for many years, finally let go of its secret, but only partially. And along with the ashes of the extinguished fire, something worse than death came into the world, the silence that hid someone else's skill. September 2021. Only a week has passed since the body of Kurt Potts was found in a burned-out workshop on the outskirts of Bend. In a hospital room, Harrison Boyd, the main and so far only suspect, lay under guard. His face was charred, his hands were covered with bandages, but he had regained consciousness. Detective Mark Ross had come to see him in the morning. According to the nurse, the first interrogation began the same day when the doctors allowed a short conversation. Ross insisted that the body found in the stuffed animal belonged to the man who had disappeared 11 years earlier. Why did it end up here, in his workshop? Boyd calmly replied that he had nothing to do with it. According to him, he had acquired the scarecrow about 10 years ago, second-hand, from a hunter who was selling taxidermy. The name he gave was vague. Luke, I think, or Luke Henderson, lived somewhere in the mountains, closer to Lane County. Ross didn't believe it at first, but he had to check it out. In a memo, he noted, "Suspect story needs to be verified. Possible previous owner is a hunter known in the community as Luke." The next day, the results of the examination came back from the laboratory. The knife found among Boyd's burnt belongings turned out to be a hunter's tool. Only traces of deer and bear blood were found on the blade. No human biological materials were found. The same result was obtained for other items, such as saws, hammers, and even a work apron. Everything pointed to professional activity, not to concealment of a crime. The lawyers immediately warned the detective, without evidence, the charge would fall apart. A few days later, Boyd was officially released on his own recognizance as a witness. The police report stated, "Suspect Harrison Boyd has been released due to lack of direct evidence of involvement in the crime. The investigation is ongoing." Despite this, Ross did not let him out of his sight. He saw Boyd not just as an accidental owner of a strange trophy, but as a link in a long chain. In the sheriff's office, he sat over old photos of the fire scene, studying the arrangement of the tools. Many of the pictures showed the same detail: bags of sawdust stored by the dozens. It was as if the entire workshop was intended not for repair, but for the production of new scarecrows. At the same time, Ross initiated a background check on the mysterious Luke. The Forestry Department's databases did indeed list several men with that name who worked as hunting guides or had hunting permits. One of them, Luke Henderson, attracted attention, a former logger who lost his license after a conflict with inspectors in 2013. After that, his trail was lost. The detective ordered a copy of the old report. It said that Henderson was not only hunting, but also making trophies on his own. He had basic knowledge of taxidermy and used chemicals to treat skins. The inspector's comment included the phrase, "A person of unstable behavior, prone to aggression, probably lives as a hermit." Gradually, a familiar silhouette emerged in all of this, almost the same one described by Hunter Alvin Crawford 11 years ago. Ross went back to the archive and reread the old report of his testimony. The beard, the aggression, the "get off my land," there was too much of a match. That evening, he called a short meeting with his colleagues. The minutes record that the detective proposed a new hypothesis. Boyd is not the perpetrator, but only the ultimate owner. He probably bought the scarecrow without knowing what it contained. The real criminal is the person who made the scarecrow using a human body as a base. From that moment on, the investigation changed direction. Ross no longer saw an ordinary murder. He was dealing with a person who had not only taken a life, but had turned the victim into a part of his work. This level of premeditation was indicative of pathology or obsession. The search for Henderson lasted several days. No current addresses, phone numbers, or documents were found. The last mention was in a police report from Lane County, a misdemeanor for illegal trapping on private property. After that, it was silence. Ross turned to Henderson's former colleagues, hunters who knew him before he disappeared. One of them, Thomas Lewis, agreed to testify. According to him, Henderson was a man who did not know how to live among others. He knew the forest to the last stone, knew how to survive without electricity, and could go weeks without seeing people. His adoration of trophies bordered on obsession. Lewis recalled that he had seen several times in his pantry stuffed animals made so realistically that they were eerie. The detective listened to these words and understood. Boyd was most likely telling the truth. He could have bought the trophy without even suspecting that what was inside was not wood and metal, but human bones. But then a new question arose. How many such trophies could a real master have made? In the laboratory, the forensic scientists continued their research. The marks on Potts' bones showed that the body had been dismembered with surgical precision. It was not the work of a random person, but someone who understood anatomy and had experience in tissue preservation. The seams of the skin showed traces of glue that had not been produced since the mid-20s, a rare professional composition available only to taxidermists. The forensic report only confirmed the detective's guess. The person who created the scarecrow was no amateur. At the end of September, Ross was drawing up a new plan of action. His entry in his office journal was brief. Search for Luke Henderson, potential criminal, dangerous, probably still in Oregon forests. It felt like he was back at the beginning of the story, where Kurt Potts had disappeared. Now the forest had a new name, a new shadow. And this shadow belonged to a man who knew how to wait. October of 2021 in Oregon was cold and damp. Autumn rain was washing away the roads, and the fog that was sliding down from the Cascade Mountains stretched between the trees like a living mass. Detective Mark Ross arrived in Lane County with only a few threads to go on old documents, fuzzy photographs, and a name, Luke Henderson. A shared database of several sheriff's departments confirmed that the man did exist. He was a former logger, hunter, and poacher, arrested several times for illegal hunting and possession of weapons without a license. In 2013, he disappeared from the police's sight, leaving behind only unpaid fines. Since then, according to witnesses, he has been living somewhere in the mountains, like a shadow. Ross moved to the town of Oak Ridge, a small community lost among pine trees and old sawmill roads. It was here, according to locals, that Henderson was sometimes seen. Some called him an eccentric, others a dangerous loner. The owner of a hunting shop recalled that a few years ago he came to buy knives and special solutions for leather processing. Then he disappeared. The detective recorded the testimony. A middle-aged man, bearded, thin, with hands covered with scars. He did not speak much. He paid in cash. He smelled strong, like chemicals or preservatives. Then the path led deeper into the forest, to an old ranch that once belonged to the Henderson family. Accompanying them was a team from the Lane County Sheriff's Office, 4 officers and a forensic scientist. They drove down a narrow road, the wheels slipping on the clay, the trees closing in over the roof of the car. When they finally reached the gate, they found the grounds overgrown with weeds and the house dilapidated. It was quiet inside. There were empty chemical bottles on the floor, torn pieces of canvas, and cans with labels like arsenic and formaldehyde. The smell of decomposition and old sawdust was in the air. On the table were traces of work, knives, needles, hardened glue. Among them was a disassembled stuffed coyote. There was a gaping hole in the wall through which the wind was driving rain. In the back of the house, they found what looked like a workshop. Hooks for skins hung along the walls, and the remains of wooden frames were on the floor. One of the forensic experts noted that the room had been abandoned recently. There was a mug of dried coffee on the table and a newspaper next to it. The newspaper was dated October 2010. In the margins, numbers and coordinates were written in pencil, reminiscent of places in the Willamette Forest. Among them was the Pine Ridge Loop trailhead. Ross immediately realized that these markings were not accidental. Henderson seemed to have known about Kurt Potts's search back then, and may have been watching it. Another strange item was found among the belongings, a damaged battery from an old radiophone, a model that was used by rangers or hunters in the early 2000s. This could mean that Henderson had a connection with the outside world, perhaps even listening to police channels. Experts recorded everything, but the main thing was missing: Henderson himself. It was clear that he had left in a hurry. His coat was hanging on a coat rack, cigarette butts were smoldering in the stove, and an open backpack with only a few things missing was in the corner. Ross said later in a memo, "The place looks like a person went out for a minute and never came back." In the yard, among the dirt and debris, forensic experts found the remains of a metal container. At the bottom of it was a thin layer of frozen glue, identical to the one used for the scarecrows. This confirmed that this was the place where Henderson made his works. The search team examined the surrounding area within a radius of several miles. In the forest, they found several hunting shelters, old huts built of boards and tarpaulins. Inside, there were traces of life, cans, empty cartridge cases, and the remains of a fire. But not a single document, photograph, or personal item that could tell more. When Ross returned to the car, it was evening. The rain had started to fall again, hitting the roof in thin streams. Drops reflected in the headlights, and the forest seemed alive. It was breathing, watching. The detective couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching his back. That evening, he contacted FBI analysts, passing on the coordinates from the newspaper. A preliminary analysis showed that most of the marked points coincided with the places where people had disappeared in the national forest over the past 20 years. This information did not make it to the press, but it caused alarm among the agents. The next day, Ross went to the ranch again. He wanted to check it out for himself. At the gate, he found fresh tire tracks, not his team's, not the company's. Someone had been here during the night. The suspect obviously knew he was being searched. The report states, The suspect is probably alive, has knowledge of the area, avoids contact, may be armed. Gradually, the hunt turned into a game of nerves. Ross realized that he was dealing not just with a killer, but with a man who thought like a hunter. Henderson knew how to hide his tracks, how to lead his pursuers away, and how to wait. Locals began to say that strange noises had reappeared in the forest. One farmer said that he heard metallic strikes at night, similar to the sound of an axe on iron. Another claimed to have seen the light of a lantern in the fog, which disappeared as soon as he approached. The detective carefully collected all the testimonies. He had no proof, but his instinct told him that Henderson was close. The forest that had once swallowed Kurt Potts was now hiding a different beast, and it was no longer him who was hunting. It was late October 2021. The Willamette National Forest was already in a cold silence. Wet leaves, empty roads, fog sliding between the trees. Detective Mark Ross had received new coordinates from the technical department. They matched the markings found earlier on an old newspaper in Henderson's hideout. The point was deep in the forest, in a former mining settlement long abandoned after fires in the 50s. The area was inaccessible, a narrow road that was lost between the hills, and then only on foot. For local hunters, these places had a bad reputation. They were called blind valleys because radio signals went out and compasses went crazy. That's why Ross decided to act immediately. Any delay gave Henderson a chance to disappear again. The raid was prepared in a hurry, but with maximum precision. A group of 8 Lane County officers, 2 dog handlers, and a helicopter crew with a thermal imaging camera were involved in the operation. The official order, signed by the sheriff, was simple. Capture the suspect alive. Use of force only if threatened. When the team arrived, they stopped half a mile from the old barracks. They continued on foot. The wind brought the smell of raw wood and rust. According to one of the officers, the forest was so quiet that even the dogs were breathing cautiously. When they got closer, they saw 3 tilted buildings, the remains of a mining camp. The roofs were caved in, the windows boarded up, but the signs of life were obvious. One of the doors had a fresh knife scratch on it. The officers split up into sectors. Inside the first building, there were cans, scraps, cigarette butts, and a bottle of water. In the second, there was an old sleeping bag, still warm to the touch. On the table was a torn map with markings. Everything indicated that the person had been here recently, perhaps a few hours ago. The criminalist later noted in his report, "No traps, no signs of panic. The place was left in a hurry." Ross examined the floor carefully. In one corner where water had seeped in, a clear boot print remained in the damp soil. The size was a man's, about a 43, with a characteristic tread pattern of hunting shoes. The dog handler immediately brought the dog, a German shepherd named Burke. The animal picked up the scent and reacted instantly, pulling towards the slope that descended into the valley. The team followed. A few minutes later, a voice from the helicopter came through Ross's headphones. "I've got movement on the thermal imager between the trees. One object appears to be a person." But the fog was getting thicker, and the connection was cut off. The slopes were getting steeper, the ground slippery. Ross walked ahead, keeping his weapon at the ready. The dogs stubbornly pulled on, barking short and sporadically. According to one of the officers, the atmosphere was not like hunting, but like searching for something invisible. Everyone realized that it could be an ambush, but they walked in silence. After half an hour of pursuit, they came to a narrow path trampled by fresh footprints. The branches were broken, and on one bush hung a string of gray fabric, which looked like a jacket. Ross put it in his pack and continued walking. The wind changed direction, and the sheepdog became excited again. The scent was close. Then the terrain dropped off sharply to a stream. There, on the clay near the water, were several barefoot prints. Henderson had obviously kicked off his shoes to cross the water unnoticed. This decision saved him. The dogs lost the scent. The dog handlers tried to recover the trail, but in vain. The current had carried everything away. Ross ordered them to split into 2 groups to go around the valley from both sides. The report stated, "Suspect is moving erratically, without a plan, probably exhausted, poorly oriented." All signs indicated that Henderson was not preparing a trap, but simply running away. The rain intensified, the mud stuck to their shoes, and the flashlights went out due to moisture. When night fell, they decided to continue the search operation. Retreating would mean losing their only chance. The helicopter made several circles over the forest, but the thick cover of clouds and trees hid everything that was happening below them. At 5 o'clock in the morning, according to Officer Peter Collins, the dog picked up the trail again near a large stone outcropping. The prints led upward to a mountain gully where the forest became denser. The smell of smoke was in the air, faint but noticeable. Henderson had probably made a small fire to keep warm. The team moved forward in silence. Some officers later recalled feeling a strange sense of presence, as if they were being watched. They heard footsteps in every rustle, movement in every shadow. But they saw no one. When they finally came to the clearing where the hut or shelter was supposed to be, there was only a cinder block. The remains of a tree were still smoking, and a metal kettle was lying nearby. Henderson had left this place a few hours before they arrived. The words were chalked on a stone near the fire. "You came too late." For the police, this was a sign that he knew they were looking for him and had been following them. Detective Ross wrote briefly in his report, "Suspect is in control of the situation, probably within 10 miles of current location. Operation is ongoing." That night, the Willamette Forest was like a living creature, lurking and listening. The team's footsteps dissolved into fog, and every sound seemed to come from the darkness. Henderson was no longer a myth or a ghost, just a tired man who knew the circle was closing. But even when he was cornered, he remained dangerous. And somewhere ahead, in the thick, damp darkness between the streams and rocks, his trail still steamed with warmth as if the breath of the forest itself. The end of October, 2021. Dawn greeted the group in a swampy valley where the forest gradually turned into a chaos of streams and bushes. The dog, which had been chasing them since the previous evening, suddenly stopped near the muddy water. Then nothing happened. The wet soil hid the tracks, and the stream, which ran through the autumn leaves, finally washed away the scent. The dog handler's report later read, "The trail breaks off near a stream. Presumably, the suspect entered the water to hide the route. Further pursuit is not possible without splitting the group." Detective Mark Ross, standing in the fog, surveyed the area. The humid air smelled of swamp and rot, and only the distant cries of crows could be heard. The area seemed enclosed, a small hollow framed on all sides by hills and dense thickets. He realized that Henderson couldn't be far away. A person who runs away leaves not only footprints, but also air, broken branches, and a trail of fear. Ross ordered them to split into 2 groups. The first went to the left, going around the valley along the slope, and the second went to the right, across the streams. He stayed in the middle, keeping in touch with everyone by radio. The wind brought fragmented phrases, the sound of splashing water, and the officers' heavy breathing. Gradually, they were drawn into the silence that the forest seemed to have deliberately created for this scene. All that could be heard was the distant crackling of branches and drops falling from the branches onto their hoods. Ross walked slowly, watching every stone. Underfoot was soft soil, sometimes mud. Several times he thought he saw a shadow between the trees, but it dissolved into fog. Suddenly, a short radio message came from his right flank, hoarse and fragmentary. "I have contact." These words belonged to a young officer who was the last in the column. When the squad arrived, he was standing behind a large, rough rock, still shaking with shock. According to him, he walked around the boulder and almost came face to face with the man sitting behind it. He was unarmed, dirty, and had a face that looked older than his own age. When the officer pointed a flashlight at him, the man raised his hands and said only one thing: "Enough." That was the first time Detective Ross saw Luke Henderson after 11 years of investigation. His appearance is described in the report: thin, gaunt, wearing a tattered raincoat, his face covered in dirt. He had abrasions on his hands and traces of a chemical rash on his cheeks. His eyes were red and his pupils were uneven. There were no signs of intoxication. He did not put up any resistance. On the contrary, he seemed like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. When they searched him, they found only a folding knife, a metal spoon, and a small jar of poisonous reagents. No weapons were found. According to eyewitnesses, his first words after his arrest were not about escaping, but about what happened 11 years ago. He spoke quietly but confidently. According to the officers, his story sounded like a confession. Henderson said he was living in the woods near the Pine Ridge Loop Trail that day. He was not looking for people, but considered this area his. When he saw a stranger lighting a fire, he went over to warn him. A quarrel ensued between them. Kurt Potts, he said, tried to move on, and he rushed to meet him. Then there was a few seconds of struggle, a stone in his hand, a scream, a blow. Henderson said he died instantly. He was confused, tried to bury the body, but the ground was too hard. Then he remembered his craft. His words were recorded by one of the officers. "I just did what I knew how to do. I didn't want him to disappear. I didn't want anyone to find him. I hid him like you hide an animal." When Ross heard this, he just nodded. He didn't see Henderson as a predator, but as a man who had been eaten up by the forest, the same forest that had kept its secrets for years. The detainee was taken out of the valley slowly. The way back was difficult: mud, water, slippery stones. Henderson walked alone, not resisting, only occasionally stumbling. Two officers walked beside him. When they reached an open area, the fog cleared and the sun broke through the trees. For the first time in days, the forest looked calm, as if nothing had happened. Ross stood back, watching the suspect being put into the car. He was not happy. The feeling of accomplishment seemed alien and cold. In an official report filed that evening, he wrote, "The suspect was detained without the use of force. He gave a voluntary confession during the arrest. The motive for the crime is a domestic conflict. His emotional state is unstable. He partially admits his guilt." As the convoy of cars headed back to the highway, Ross stood by the creek for a while, listening to the sound of the water. He was thinking about Potts, an ordinary man who just went out into the woods and never came back, and about Henderson, the man who turned the forest into his cage. When the last noise of the engines died down, the valley was silent again. The same silence that had reigned for 11 years. The forest, which had kept its secrets for so long, had finally given one of them away, not as a triumph, but as a reminder. There are no winners in the wilderness. There are only those who could not find their way back.